Okay, hello. So I'm Rachel Cooper, and this is a short video to go with my paper. Before I start, I'd just like to thank the conference organisers for inviting me. Thank Lisa Bortolotti for her partner paper to this paper, and thank you all for having a look at this. So I want to start by giving some context to the paper. So there's a project that's been going on in philosophy of medicine, which has been trying to get an account of disorder. I'm going to talk about some problems that I think affect this project caused by conceptual change, and then talk about some possible ways forward. So first of all, for the context, so since the 1970s, lots of people in the philosophy of medicine have been trying to get an account of disorder. And when people talk about getting an account of disorder, the terms disorder or disease tend to be used interchangeably, and they're used to refer to the umbrella concept of any kind of pathological condition. So in these discussions, injuries, wounds, and diseases all get lumped together. And the problem is to figure out what distinguishes disorders from other types of state. So what distinguishes disorders from moral failings, normal benign differences, social and educational problems, and so on. And the method that people have used is traditional conceptual analysis. So philosophers have been trying to get a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as a disorder. And they've refined those sets of necessary and sufficient conditions by thinking about how we'd classify various actual and hypothetical cases. The aim has been to produce a descriptive account of our current concept of disorder. So the thought would be that if some decent account was finally developed, then speakers should, when it's explained to them, say something like, oh yes, that's what I was getting at. So this is a project that's been going on for some time. Of the accounts that have been developed, I think they can be seen as falling into two main camps. So on the one side of the debate, there's been Christopher Bors and some other philosophers who agree with him. And he thinks that whether something's a disorder or not is purely a matter of biological fact. So his is a value-free account. It's at least as value-free as biological concepts can be. But he thinks that someone has a disorder if they have a biological dysfunction, and that's purely a factual matter. And then on the other side of the debate, there's been me and many other people in the philosophy of medicine who thought that Bors was wrong, and that for something to count as a disorder, it has to be harmful for the person with it. So we've had various value-laden accounts. And until very recently, it seemed to me that value-laden accounts were clearly right. So the test cases that push you one way or the other with these two camps concern what one wants to say about non-harmful dysfunctions. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were huge debates about homosexuality within psychiatry. Eventually, the American Psychiatric Association had a vote, and the consensus was that homosexuality shouldn't be considered to be a disorder. And the interesting thing about homosexuality is that the etiology of homosexuality is unknown, and it's possible that there might be some kind of biological dysfunction that gives rise to homosexuality. So you can imagine that people might have evolved to be sexually attracted to members of the opposite sex, and maybe something goes wrong with some biological function in cases of homosexuality. So I'm not saying that's true, but it's at least a possibility. And the interesting thing in these debates is that whether or not that was the case, the consensus was that it didn't really matter at the end of the day. So the key thing is that insofar as homosexual people can have flourishing lives and it's okay to be gay, that homosexuality shouldn't be considered a disorder, even if there is some kind of dysfunction. So the consensus was in the mental health field after these debates that homosexuality shouldn't be considered a disorder because it's not harmful. Which goes along with a value-laden account of disorder. So it seemed to me, until quite recently, that value-laden accounts of disorder were clearly right, at least if you're looking for a descriptive account of our concept of disorder. Okay, now for the problem. So the problem is that I think there has been a change of heart. So after the debates about homosexuality for about 30 years, mental health professionals mainly agreed that for something to be a disorder, it had to be harmful. But then they changed their mind. So 2013 is the date that the latest classification of mental disorders came out. So the DSM's the main classification of disorders, and the definition in there changed. So it went from being a value-laden definition, where someone could only have a disorder if their condition caused them harm, to being a value-free definition. And there's also been changes in how people talk about tic disorders. So those are discussed more in the paper, but the key thing is that I think there's evidence that mental health professionals have changed the way they think about disorder, such that, although until quite recently there was a consensus that something could only be a disorder if it caused harm, I think that consensus is breaking down. And this causes problems for people engaged in the project of trying to get a descriptively adequate conceptual analysis of disorder. So accounts according to which harm is necessary for disorder, I think, used to be clear winners, but this is no longer the case. So mental health professionals have changed the way that they think, changed the way that they talk, and they're a fairly significant linguistic community if you're thinking about how disorder gets used. And I think this kind of problem probably occurs quite a lot. So over the last couple of decades, quite a lot of authors have been writing about conceptual change in various contexts. So Laporte talks about conceptual change in science as a result of scientific discovery. People have also been thinking about the way in which concepts get changed through political renegotiation. Ian Hacking's written a lot about humankind terms, the kinds of terms we use to describe kinds of people, might be particularly prone to change. So this causes challenges for conceptual analysis. So I take it that the objective in conceptual analysis is to try to get a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And the worry is that if you're a conceptual analyst, you might find at some particular point in time that there's something's necessary. But then a few years down the line, that may no longer be the case. So I think harm used to be necessary for disorder, but maybe it no longer is. Now, something that I fudge in the paper is exactly how to characterise what's going on here. So there are some footnotes in the paper. I don't have an account of concepts. I'm not sure what the individuation criteria for concepts should be. So I don't know whether I should say that there's one concept of disorder which has changed over time, or whether it's better to think that there was one concept and then it got replaced by a successor concept. I don't think I need to resolve that issue here, because for me, the key problem is that there's been some kind of conceptual shift such that, although 10 years ago, I think it was necessary that someone had to be harmed by a condition for it to count as a disorder. Now there are sizable linguistic communities, mental health professionals, for example, where they don't talk in that way anymore. So the question is, well, what to do? I'm going to talk about three options. So the first two options are actually being pursued by other people in the philosophy of medicine already. I'm going to talk about those options. I'm not entirely against those options, though I'm going to voice some reservations I have about them. And then I'm going to talk about my preferred and new option, which is to try to belt and brace conceptual claims. So the thought there is that there might be ways to make conceptual claims that are going to be fairly robust in the face of possible changes to the way we talk that might occur in the near future. Okay, so the first option is to just give up. So there are some people in the philosophy of medicine who have written papers fairly recently where they say, look, philosophers of medicine have been trying to get an account of disorder for some decades. They haven't really succeeded. Maybe the concept of disorder isn't actually all that important after all. We ought to just stop stop this project. So Erosevsky has got a paper from 2009, Heslow has a paper from 1993. They think that instead of worrying about the concept of disorder, we might switch to asking questions like, in what sorts of cases is it legitimate to improve quality of life by taking mind-altering drugs? Or can personality change due to head trauma excuse wrongdoing? So instead of trying to figure out what we ought to do to help people, or how we ought to treat people via wondering about whether or not they have a disorder, we could go straight to consider the kinds of empirical and moral questions that we're actually interested in without using the concept of disorder. Now, I think that rephrasing questions so that they don't talk about disorders is one way to go in some contexts, but I worry about just abandoning the project of trying to get a general account of disorder altogether, because I'm interested in the concept of disorder, but not just because, you know, I really, really want to get a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for disorder. I'm interested in how disorder, the concept of disorder, fits into a network of concepts, which includes concepts of treatment, excuse, medical authority, and so on. And one of the reasons for trying to get a philosophical account of disorder is it might be hoped to shed light on a network of conceptual questions, such as, you know, why is it that disorders can sometimes excuse people? Do we have a duty to help people with disorders, and so on? So I'm not too keen on option one. Option two is that there are people in the philosophy of medicine who say, look, this descriptive project of trying to figure out what our account of this descriptive project of trying to work out what our concept of disorder is isn't going too well. Maybe what we ought to do is to shift to a revisionary project. So instead of trying to capture our concept of disorder and then getting into trouble if that concept changes, we could instead worry about what concept or concepts might be best. And revisionary projects come in two flavours. There are some people who want to revise our concepts to enable better science. Some people want to revise concepts to enable better politics. So Sally Haslinger has projects where she's trying to get concepts for better politics. And so that might be one way to go. Now, again, I'm not entirely against revisionary projects, but I have a worry. My worry is that what is going to count as the best definition depends on what your interests are, it depends on what your project is. Disorder, I think, is a concept that gets used for very many different purposes. So disorder plays a role in thinking about medicine, but it also plays a role in organising our bureaucracies and legal frameworks when it comes to, you know, excuses, disability payments, sickness payments, all this kind of stuff. And when a concept gets used for multiple different purposes and the effects can depend so much on context, I think it can be very hard to predict what definition is going to be best. And I think you also end up with coordination problems when different projects have to come together. So I'm not against revisionary projects entirely, but I have some reservations about them. Okay, so now this is for the third option. Now, my thought is that, so my worry is that traditional conceptual analysis can fall into problems because at one point you find something that's a necessary criteria and then things change and it's just not necessary anymore. Now, the idea with using belts and braces to keep up your trousers is that if your belt breaks, your braces will keep it up. If your braces break, your belt will keep your trousers up. And I think we might try to do something similar when we're making conceptually based claims. So the thought is that sometimes we can support a conceptually based claim in multiple ways, and then even if one necessary conceptual connection gives way in the future, the others can be hoped to hold. Just to use another metaphor, so there's a technique that climbers use when they're climbing on unstable rock, So what you've got here is you've got a picture of the bits of metal equipment that are going into the rock. And if the rock was really strong, you'd only have one of these bits of equipment and you'd put your rope through it and you'd climb up. But in a situation where you worry that the rock might give way, what you do is you shove in as many anchor points as you can and hope that at least some of them will stay. So the thought is that we might attempt something similar. So if we return to thinking about what's at issue when there's this debate going on between the value-free people and the value-laden people when they're thinking about disorder, the big dispute is whether the medical domain, which I've taken to be broadly equivalent to the domain of disorders, though Lisa in her paper takes issue with that. So the major dispute has been over whether you only need to know about biology to figure out whether something's a disorder or not, or whether moral and political values are also involved. Now, what I think is that our current concept of disorder is currently such that values are involved in figuring out whether something is a disorder or not in very many different ways, over and over again. So I think values are involved in multiple ways. So until very recently, I think there was a very direct connection between something having to be harmful and disorder. So until very recently, I think that we only considered a condition to be a disorder if it was harmful. But as I've said, the way that some mental health professionals talk now, that necessity might be giving way. But I think there are also indirect ways in which ethical and political values are involved in determining whether or not something is a disorder. So I think that our current concept of disorder is such that someone has to be counted as unlucky to have a disorder. Something it can't just be completely normal. So wrinkles don't count as a disorder because they happen to everybody. You've got to be, it's got to be unusual. You've got to be unlucky in some way. And I think values end up playing a role in judging how unlucky someone has to be to count as having a disorder. I think it's also part of our concept of disorder that a disorder is internal to the person with it. So we distinguish between environmental problems and disorders. Disorders are internal. And in the paper I sketch how I think values end up playing a role in us determining whether we consider the source of the problem to be within the individual or external to them. And there might be other ways in which values get involved. So quite a lot of people have argued that the notion of dysfunction ends up depending on value judgments. I think that quite probably values are involved in distinguishing between disorders and vices. So the basic thought is that there might be multiple conceptual connections between our concept of disorder and ethical and political judgments. And then even if the ways in which people talk change over time, such that one or more of these connections gives way, then the rest are likely to stay, at least for some time into the future. So my thought is that figuring out whether something's a disorder or not ends up depending on value judgments, and by that I mean kind of ethical and political value judgments in many ways. So for now and for some time into the future, whether a condition is a disorder cannot be settled by biological facts alone. And that's it. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.